Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. This episode of Reinventing Parking focuses on interactions between parking reform, ageing, and disability issues. It features highlights from a roundtable discussion that was hosted a few months ago by the Parking Reform Network. But first, let me briefly mention that the parking-focused book by Slate journalist Henry Grabar is out, and it's been generating a great surge of media attention for parking reform, especially in North America. The book is called Paved Paradise: How Parking Explains the World. Do a web search and you'll find some of that media coverage. They include the New York Times, the LA Times, NPR, Curbed, Vox, Harper's Magazine, Bloomberg, Slate, The Washington Post, and various others. If any of that coverage leaves you feeling inspired, then your next step should be to go to parkingreform.org to find out more about the Parking Reform Network and to join if you're not already a member. Even just signing up for the weekly email newsletter will help you as a parking reformer. And of course, you should also get the book. Okay, now let's get back to that round table. Can parking reform coexist with justice for frail aging people and for people with disabilities? That was the central theme of the Parking Reform Network roundtable on parking reform, aging, and disability. The event had 4 guests with a wealth of experience and insight on these issues. They were Cassie Wilson, who is a climate, transportation and disability justice organizer who lives in a rural area near Portland, Oregon. She has a mobility-related disability and uses a wheelchair and is also able to drive a wheelchair-accessible vehicle. Correlette Hannon, who works in AARP's Department of Government Affairs, focusing on housing, transportation, broadband, and energy advocacy. AARP was formerly called the American Association of Retired Persons, and it's an interest group in the United States focusing on issues affecting those over the age of 50. Megan Lynch, who is the founder of UC Access Now, a coalition of students, staff, and faculty throughout the University of California system who work to dismantle ableism in the UC system. And finally, Anna Zivarts, who is the director of the Disability Mobility Initiative, a program within Disability Rights, Washington. Zivarts is vision impaired and organizes with other people who can't drive a car, whether because of a disability or for other reasons. You will also hear the voice of Tony Jordan, who is the co-founder and president of the Parking Reform Network. Tony moderated the session. It was a long session, but what you will hear now is 27 minutes of highlights. I hope you find it as interesting and informative as I did. First, you'll hear from Tony Jordan, then Megan Lynch, Cassie Wilson, Correlette Hannon, and Anna Zivarts in that order.
Okay, so let's start out. In the arguments you've heard for or against parking reforms, including my discussions with you, which do you find compelling? Do you find any capricious or not very compelling? Like, what do you think are the, what's your kind of basic read on parking policy reform?
Okay, I'll mention something that you said during the conversation we had, which is, I think, literally the first time I've heard this. What I'm used to, and I would assume other disabled people here are used to in this space, is within both car-centrism and new urbanism, there's ableism on either side because we live in an ableist society. It's not something that, one political bent has a monopoly on. And because of that, the conversations that I witness and participate in sometimes in Twitter and whatnot, kind of use disabled people just as a cudgel, which is the car centrists will leap in and they'll say, we can't do this because disabled people need this. And then people on the other side will say, not everybody can afford a car. Disabled people make less money, which is often true. But we're not really talking to actual disabled people. And one of the things you mentioned that I don't think I've ever heard anybody mention on either side of it was, well, if disabled people, need the parking spaces. Certain disabled people really have a great need of disabled parking spaces. Let's just, make fewer parking spaces, but make more of them disabled parking spaces. And I just wanted to mention that because it's a very novel suggestion that I've never heard anybody make before.
I was also going to comment that, yeah, literally whenever I see conversations for or against really anything in the world of transportation, yeah, it's very often a bunch of non-disabled people claiming what is or isn't ableist on either side. And I think in reality, a lot of it is just, a lot more nuanced than people want it to be. And a lot of times disabled people just aren't run to conversation. So thank you for this roundtable. I mean, to me, the most compelling reasons for parking reform is just it's easier to build more densely. It's easier to build affordable housing, prevent further sprawl, reduce reliance on cars, all good things. I think too, a lot of people just miss, for example, with parking mandates, eliminating parking mandates, doesn't mean that parking's not going to be built. And I think a lot of people miss that.
That's a very good point. The thing that I would just mention is sometimes I feel like some people may think older adults may fall into the same category or may have the same feeling about the parking reform issue, and that's not always the case. There was an issue that came up in Maryland, for instance, where our state office was in support of removing certain parking requirements at I think it was more of a shopping area where there were a lot of folks on foot, and there was a call for reducing parking. And then we had a member actually reach out and say that no, she didn't agree with the position we were taking, because when her daughter needs to drop her off in this shopping center, that she needs to be able to get out in front of the building and be able to have her daughter park in front of the building. So it's easier for her to get in and out because she cannot walk long distances without needing to take a rest. So I think we need to remember not to think that everyone who falls into a certain group is going to have the same position on an issue. We really need to look at the nuances and the personal experiences that folks may be bringing to the table, which may color the position that they're taking.
This is Anna, and I can jump in with, I think this is all just, a really great and interesting conversation. A lot of the work we do is surveying and interviewing and then organizing non-drivers. And I think so that's sort of where I gain a lot of knowledge from people with different experiences than my own, which is very specific.
Sure.
And, I moved to Seattle. I had grown up in this region, and then I lived in New York City for a long time. And, as in New York City, such a large percentage of people don't own vehicles or have access to vehicles. And the existence of free street parking is interesting, and it's something that a lot of transportation advocates there push back against. In Seattle, where I live now, I live on a street that has free street parking. It's a neighborhood street on both sides of the street. And because of that, it has become a de facto one-way street. And so it actually acts to calm traffic. And so even, coming from New York, I would have been someone who was like, okay, we need to reduce the amount of street parking. Here in Seattle, the free street parking is what keeps my street to be safe for people walking and rolling, because the speeds are so limited. Just throwing that out there to complicate things a little bit. The other thing I want to touch on is what it feels like to try to navigate these landscapes that are so dominated by big surface parking lots. And that's often because of sort of our tax structures and also parking requirements, but how difficult it can be to get to the front of a store when that distance is much longer because of these giant surface parking lots and so much of the country. And so that is something that I think we should be talking about, because it does become a greater distance to cross, perhaps an unsafe distance, and also just makes people feel like the only reasonable way to get to a location is driving, because the pedestrian environment is so hostile.
That's fantastic. And I think I'm going to say paid on-street parking can provide traffic calming just as well as unpaid as free on-street parking. And the idea of how much we should remove on-street parking is one that definitely comes up in the parking reform world. My personal, and I think our organizational approach to this is, if there's a better use for on-street parking, like a bike lane or a bus lane or a wider sidewalk or maybe even street seating, something else that takes that place, it's worth it to replace it. In my opinion, much on-street parking does provide access, especially if it is managed so people don't have to circle around to get into it. So I think that's not in conflict necessarily. Like, just making our streets wider probably isn't going to make things safer or better for us. I also think it's really interesting. A theme here is the things that provide mobility to some people may reduce the mobility for other people, like the service lot mentioned for the grocery store or for the shopping center does provide easier access for someone who has someone to drive them, but then for someone getting off the bus is quite a large barrier to the store. And so I think that's a theme here is kind of like, how do we trade off? I'm thinking about this, that most of the reforms are future looking, right? So thinking about future development and in mind that the vast majority of most of our infrastructure is currently built to accommodate cars primarily. How important do we think that new car parking is to accessibility for people with mobility issues? Given that there are so many shopping centers that are completely car dominant, is it okay to build shopping centers or to build development that may be harder to get to by car, given that the majority of our options are car centric?
I think it's really context dependent. And, you were saying, and other people have pointed out that there are, that it's a complex issue. And it's one of the reasons why, I think, our society, every communication should be accessible, but especially in the transit space, I was just having to point this out this morning as I saw, a transit Twitter account publish something about an event as an image that had no alt text, right? So who are a group of the population that use transit a lot? It's blind people. And so if you're publishing your event information for your transit discussions or your transit actions as an image that doesn't have alt text, you're not including blind and low vision people in your conversation. And so as a baseline, I would say as a field, you really have to work on accessibility of your communications and your venues that you're having your meetings, the ways you're having your meetings. The pandemic's still going on. I know I can't personally go to in-person stuff right now. So, trying to do things hybrid. And when you make your communications accessible and sort of extend the welcome mat that way, then what you can do is you can get a more diversely disabled population, and that's diverse by a number of things because each disability can be different. Even within the same disability, it can be a little bit different. Then you have, people who are marginalized in ways other than disability. And their opinions and their lived experiences are going to be different than mine would be. So you don't want like a token representative of disability. You want as many different disabled people in your space as you can, because that's how you're going to get the answers of what's the best kind of like highest common denominator shared accessibility shared need that we have. There's a concept within the disability community of something called conflicting access needs. So for instance, I have CPTSD, and because of my experience and how I got this, one of the things that's a trigger for me is dogs. But at the same time, there are people who need dogs for their disability. And so sometimes there's things where you have to work it out. And so there's that disability conflicting access needs. So the more diversely disabled your group is, and like the bottom line for that happening is communicating accessibly. And then you can add outreach on top of that.
I was just going to say that I think that if we're going to make locations harder to access because we're removing parking, that we really do need to take a closer look at the alternative options for folks to get to the locations where they need to go. Again, I mentioned the Maryland situation where the person who raised the concern just simply could not walk long distances. So there has to be some other way for folks to reach the destinations where they want to go.
To add on to that, I think the regional perspective too, with the alternatives to driving, because like living outside of Portland, like, my mom and I go into Portland to access healthcare regularly. And so I think lessening parking for a shopping center versus lessening parking for like the social services or something like that are, very different situations. And so in like my mom's case, like she basically needs that door to door transportation. And so it's like if we had alternatives to driving out here, then we could, take the bus into Portland or whatever. But because we don't have that, I don't know. I think that's where you get a lot of the like people from like outside of a city being like, you can't remove parking. I like to come into the city. And it's like, because they don't have an alternative way to get there.
Yeah, this is Anna kind of building off what everyone just said. I think there's this tension in the work that I do between sort of the reality that we're in right now, which is a very auto-based, car-based communities, right? And then what could be possible if this wasn't the way we organize things. So recognizing that we're not at that other point yet, and like, sure, there are many people who perhaps if they had an e-bike or I have a friend with the same eye condition I do who uses a golf cart to get around with her family in Arizona. And I think that's awesome. But like that works in certain contexts, not everywhere. And she kind of does it because there's a lot of bike lanes in Tucson and then a lot of big parking lots that she can cut through to avoid the big arterials that she's not allowed to drive on. There could be a future that we could build towards where there are alternatives to big vehicles being the way that you get from point A to point B, big privately owned vehicles. We're not there yet. So yeah, I'm just being really cognizant of that there may be a different world that's possible, but we won't get there unless we actually bring people with disabilities into the leadership and into decision-making organizations so that it's not an afterthought or completely, ignored when we're planning things.
There are a lot of ableist events that I experienced in my first quarter here as a grad student, but the catalyzing event was the lack of accessible cycle park. And the reason that ties in with reduction of auto parking is because there are disabled people who are capable of cycling, right? But if you build cycle racks that are not designed for the kinds of cycles that disabled people tend to ride, then I can't. Then I have to get in my car. I was hurt so much by these racks. My hands were hurt so badly that I couldn't do the work I was here to do. And for more than a year, I was having to take a car really just a mile or two because it was too far. I could not physically walk that far. And there was not a bus that came close enough for me to walk to the bus stop to get there. So it forced me into my car. The University of California Transportation and Parking Services departments are funded by their auto parking. I was literally told when I fought for accessible parking, we need these inaccessible racks because they fit together so tightly that it saves us more space to make for auto parking. You could also reduce the number of autos that are running around needing parking if only the cycle infrastructure were accessible. The racks differ by campus, but I can tell you, UC Davis is famous for being this, bike-friendly campus. And almost every single rack on this campus is one that I would not be able to use. So.
And those kinds of bike parking changes would also benefit, people who are using increasingly cargo bikes or other mobility devices too. One thing I've really come to appreciate much more is so often we can make changes that are really just good for many groups to people who are underserved by our status quo, that benefit, that lead towards a more walkable, a more dense, more sustainable type of built environment. I want to shift for a second real quick because I had an interesting conversation with Cassie yesterday about this, and probably the members listening would be pretty interested in is the difference between usability from on-street parking or access from on-street parking versus off-street parking. How important is specifically off-street parking versus on-street parking, especially if, let's say we just took all the parking on street and had multiple spaces for people with disabilities that were reserved. Are there shortcomings? Are there needs specifically for off-street built parking that we need to account for?
I can share more about what we were talking about with my experience. So I think a lot of it does depend on what that street is like, because a lot of my experience with on-street parking is honestly, it's rare for me to even find an accessible on-street spot. Like when I see one, I'm like, whoa, like it's like shocking to me because I rarely see them anywhere. Or when I do see one, there's like one, and you're like, I've no idea where the next nearest one would be. But a big issue that I have as a driver is like it takes me a while to get out of the car because even though I can drive, driving a car will never be fully accessible to me. So I have a whole stool system for getting in and out of the car, and so it takes me a minute. And so if the parking spot is right next to a traffic lane, if there's no like bike lane, or if there's no sort of buffer at all, then it's like I'm just specifically thinking of I was parked in an accessible spot in downtown Oregon City, which is very heavily dominated by large trucks driving around. And it was like pretty scary to get in and out of the car because I was like, I'm gonna get run over just because it takes me a minute to get out. And then additionally, like getting my mobility device out of the car takes a while. And so it's like I think it really depends the safety of the street, whether or not on-street parking works and is actually accessible. Because just because that was an accessible spot didn't mean it felt very safe to use for me. And then I think we were also talking a bit about like the pricing of like on and off street parking and stuff. And I don't know. To me, I just think about it like disabled people aren't a monolith, so like some people can afford to pay, and so I feel like it should go more based on income than anything. But I don't know. My thoughts on that part are still evolving.
And I guess from my perspective, we don't have a specific position at this point on street versus off street parking. But I think it's very context sensitive. So it depends on what the community looks like and where the opportunities are to increase the accessibility for transportation options. But the other thing I was thinking of earlier is that I also would encourage us to look at these issues within the context of other livable communities types of issues. So one of the issue areas that AARP has a history of engagement on is complete streets policy development. And I think this issue is an issue that would fit within those broader policy considerations when you're looking at the broader roadways that folks are looking to access by various means, whether it's by foot, by car, by mobility device, that the complete context of the street needs to consider the needs of all the users that potentially are going to use it.
Again, it just, outlines the importance of hearing as many different voices as possible. I tend to think of myself as somebody who's really looking out for things, and I can still miss stuff too. So, it's just good to have as much input as possible.
Kathy kind of brought this up, but I do want to spend at least a couple minutes talking about the pricing and in particular how that impacts maybe access and how it plays in with disability placards. At our party in Los Angeles, Professor Don Shute actually gave quite a long speech about disability placard abuse, which in many states and many cities, people with disability placards can park for free for unlimited amounts of time on city streets. Like in California, the cities are prohibited from charging or enforcing time limits on anyone with a disability placard. And then he brought up some statistics such that 1 in 8 California drivers has a disability placard, that the verification process for disability placard issuance is pretty lax, that cars featuring a disability placard are often parked 7 times as long as another car. So there's a lot of like impact issues where, you could paint it all blue, but if the incentive is you have the placard not for access so much, but for saving money or time, I think that his position is that creates a large incentive for fraud, or people holding onto placards or using them that aren't really issued to them, or maybe, not considering the needs of others as much. And I know it's kind of like a amorphous question, but I'm curious if there are thoughts on how important is it to have deep discounts or free parking versus, providing the accessibility of having spaces, that you might have to pay for, but at least are available. And this could potentially generate a lot of money if you're reducing disability placard abuse. Much more money can come through some of the revenue. So, like, what would be a good thing the city could spend, or a city could spend money on that it's not currently collecting that would help people with disabilities?
This is a tough one because disabled people already undergo a lot of means testing and form filling and things like that. So in general, and I had to come to this because, like everybody else, I was sort of raised in an ableist society and in some ways like in an authoritarian household where you sort of raised to think that, people are less deserving. They have to prove they're deserving, that kind of stuff. So it's something I've had to evolve out of. But, in general, you want accessibility to be available, and like I don't care if other people use it, right? But with parking, because of the way it is rationed, right? And when you have a rationed accessibility, then you get into the bureaucracy around rationing it and the rationales around rationing it. I can tell you that an awful lot of people who are on SSI, SSDI, it's not enough to even rent a place by yourself with, okay? Not having to pay for parking definitely was helpful for me in trying to make ends meet in a system that was already, I challenge anybody here to make it on $900 a month, and that's about what you're getting on SSDI. And then we have the additional problem that we have this massive housing problem, right? So there's a lot of disabled people on SSI, SSDI who end up having to live out of their cars.
Yeah, I was surprised when you had shared that story with me when we talked before because, like before that, I had really only ever heard of like disability placard fraud in the context of disabled people being falsely accused of it, especially people who don't use mobility aids being accused by non-disabled people or by disabled people who do use mobility aids as, hey, you're not disabled enough. Why are you using it? They just have some condition that you cannot tell just by looking at them. And so, yeah, but I definitely echo Megan's concerns about, like, we already go through a lot of means testing, and it can be pretty dehumanizing to, like, have, like, a non-disabled person determine whether you're disabled enough. And then it also, like, brings in the, well, if you need a doctor's note, like, equitable access to affordable health care, all of that. So, brings in some bigger systemic issues.
I guess one of our discussions was that by removing the incentive to get the free or long-term parking out of having a disability placard, the thesis is you would see less abuse of the placard because the main incentive is for the free parking. So it might reduce even scrutiny, or it hopefully should increase availability. But I hear you, and thank you for your viewpoints.
I would also point out, again, for those of us who are, terminally on Twitter, we're probably familiar with the accounts that focus on the amount of people who don't even have a placard, right? Who are parking on the sidewalk, who are blocking the bike lane, who are, so again, you get into the enforcement issue again, and you have to talk about that. But in terms of us societally, if we make it societally unacceptable, and then the other thing I would say is also design matters. So like there was something I witnessed on campus here where, and this is a new building, a new lot. So this is like 32 years post ADA, and they designed it like this. So I hate to even make this excuse, but this is the excuse they would make. We needed to use the disabled spot to unload packages and put this pallet in because we don't have a loading dock. It's like, well, who designed the building? So sometimes you even have a disabled space, but people are misusing it because of terrible design and lack of involvement of disabled people in the first place. And this building wasn't designed after UC Access Now came out and called this stuff out. So like they know.
I guess part of what I'm hearing, there's common theme here of, like, I think Corlett brought it up, the complete streets, like, our unsafe streets, our poor transit reliability, larger, fast vehicles driving down the streets. I think it was Megan mentioned you can't remove the bridge without having another bridge to go. And one of the tough things I feel about this issue is that the status quo and continuing to build the car-centric infrastructure means that for a generation, you're not going to have the type of infrastructure that provides the better access, the transit. Like the car infrastructure blocks the bike lanes, which can be used for multiple mobility devices. It blocks the transit lanes. It blocks the kinds of sidewalks and access we need. So it's a very tough balance that we're trying to navigate here.
This is Anna. I just want to throw out another thing I just put in the chat. I think there's a lot of conversation going on around electric vehicle and car charging right now, and where those should be cited and how they should be cited, and how charging can work in apartment complexes and my street where if you want to charge, you're dangling your extension cord across the sidewalk. And I can't tell you how many times I've tripped on that, not being able to see it particularly well. And then, how are these charging infrastructures being also made accessible to people with power wheelchairs who want to be able to go out and charge, and e-bikes? I think that's for me a place that it feels like there could be a really positive conversation, and a conversation that recognizes that there are many ways people get around.
Anna, I'm going to be in touch with you because we're working on this right now on some best practices, suggestions on EV charging, which is parking, and your input would be really helpful if there's something you're already thinking about. Okay, well, right on time. Once again, parkingreform.org. Please, if you're interested in this, then you're not already a member, join, support us. Thank you so much to the panelists for giving us this time. It's just, I think, really great. And I'm going to be in contact about trying to continue this conversation because I think it's one of the most important ones we can have on this. So thank you all.
Thank you
for inviting us, and thanks for bringing this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.